Thank you so much for joining us. Quick agenda. We're going to do a very quick Board 101 refresher, only a few slides because you can't hear it enough and you can't reinforce it with your board, or if you're a board member, reinforce it with your peers and your CEO. And then we're going to especially talk about the board chair relationships with the, I'm calling CEO, Chief Executive Officer. You may call it Executive Director. There's several different titles. And we're going to look at in the boardroom and out of the boardroom. And I also want to say, speak up. There will be times when I'll try to have dialogue, which is, again, interesting since I can't hear, but Victoria's monitoring the chat for us, so that will help. But this is a learning with all of us. And someone asked how long it's supposed to last today. It's only supposed to last a half hour. And so we may not have as much discussion as I would like. We're just, again, but very quickly. Legal board member duties. So this is for individual board members. These are the legal duties that you have. Duty of care, that's to be competent, you're prepared, you show interest. This is what we call the show up duty. And then duty of loyalty is that you put the interests of the organization before any personal interests or before interests of another organization. Whatever board meeting you're in for that organization, that's the hat that you have on. You hold information in confidence, and well, again, you're loyal to the organization. And then duty of obedience, that's making sure that you stay legal with all IRS implications, state of Michigan implications, and then making sure that the organization stays within its mission. Quickly, work of the board. Now, this is not CEO, this is work of the board as a whole. The board should focus on your own operations in partnership with the CEO, but this is the board's responsibility for recruiting and looking at the composition. And by all means, get the CEO's get their opinions, but it is the board that's responsible for recruiting, orienting, training, assessing yourselves as a board. The board is also responsible for the strategic planning of the organization, because as a board, you are in essence responsible for the organization. Think of it as if you were a small business owner, as if you and your peers around the board table, you all came together to form a small business. How it goes, if it's profitable or not, how many customers you have, those types of things, that's the work of the board. You quote unquote own this organization. Does not mean you get into micromanaging, and we'll get into that in a minute. But so you're responsible for looking at the long-term vision, making sure that you're being strategic, you're using the resources in the best possible way, which not only includes money, but also includes your human resources and also any physical assets that you may have. You want to make sure and provide oversight. Since you're responsible, you want to make sure financially things are secure or that you're not getting in overextended. You also want to make sure that programs are going well and that, again, you're staying legal. And because you're on the board and you quote unquote own the organization, you want to make sure you're a good ambassador and that you are able to speak about the organization, what's going on with the organization, and enhance the reputation in the public. Now, as individuals or as board members, you have 3 different hats that you wear at any given time. Governance is the one that we were just talking about, the work of the board, and that's when you are all together in a board meeting. That is as a unit, the governance, and the board is ultimately responsible. Then you have implementation, and this doesn't happen that often, but it's when you're given specific authorizations. So let's say you form a committee to look for a new space for your new office space, and you may be given authority to sign a contract up to X amount of dollars, or you are given the authority to investigate office space and report back to the board, or a committee's given that authority. So that's implementation mode. It doesn't happen as often as governance or as volunteer. And volunteer, in a lot of our smaller nonprofits, volunteer actually happens more than governance. And volunteer is when you pop in to help stuff envelopes, or to answer phones, or maybe you're volunteering with a program. It's when you are, as a board member, you are by yourself working with the organization, and you're not in the board unit as a whole. And so keep in mind that as a volunteer, you are a volunteer. You have no individual authority, whether you're the chair or a board member. That doesn't matter. You need to remember which hat you're wearing. So it all comes down to you want to make sure you have division of responsibilities, because this will play in very heavily between the chair and the CEO role. And the chair is really the liaison, or the link between the board and the CEO. And so an effective chair can go a long ways to help the organization perform at its highest capacity. And as you can see, the bottom is trust. And then on the left side, it shows examples of what the board looks at and how the board thinks and what types of questions the board asks. And then on the right side, it talks about the CEO and what the CEO asks and looks at. And if you're ever wondering if you are micromanaging, you can pull out this little chart and kind of think about, okay, what question am I asking? And let's see if that makes sense, or if we're micromanaging. And as a board, some of the questions you may want to think about are, what are you trying to accomplish? You know, what are our goals? What's the policy around this? To what extent does this relate to our mission? It's okay to ask why, and how much, how much is this, what's this going to cost? And this is where it can get difficult, because especially you're passionate about the mission, maybe you tend to micromanage. And so let's say you have a big fundraiser, and a board member, not one that was on the fundraising committee, but in a general board meeting, good questions to ask are, how much money did it raise? How many new donors did we gain? What do you feel went right? What could we improve in the future? A good question that you would want to ask as a committee member, but not in the board, is, okay, how much did we spend on XYZ? And does it make sense that we do that in the same way next year? Those detailed questions are they're easier to try to answer than the big questions, the macro questions. So it's easy to go there, but that's micromanaging, and it actually is a bottleneck for the organization. So on the flip side, boards are asking, what are we trying to accomplish? What are our goals? What's the policy? How does this relate to our mission? Versus on the flip side, the CEO looks at what has the board directed as far as what's our strategy, and then how do we do that? When, where, by whom, usually staff and volunteers. And so it's the CEO is more like an implementer, and the board sets the strategy and sets the policies, and the CEO makes sure that it happens. So for example, the board determines the mission and the purposes, and they ensure that there's effective planning, and the board again builds themselves to be a competent board. And then the chair, the CEO works to make sure, okay, these are the policies that we have in place for our organization. I want to make sure as CEO that my staff are following those and my volunteers are following those, and that as a CEO, I'm accomplishing what my board expects me to accomplish. And a lot of times we get that backwards. We have the CEO that's really driving the board forward, or we have just the opposite, where the board is micromanaging the CEO. And those are the two sides of the pendulum. We don't want to swing too far one way or the other. So really, the most important thing you can do is to define and understand your responsibilities. So define your responsibilities as a board, and we're going to talk about the board chair in particular, and as for the CEO. Now keep in mind, as the board chair, you are the leader. It's more than a title. You're the leader. And so when you're looking at what is the board's role versus the CEO's role, you are really the one that's helping to direct the board's role. The board looks to you. And so it's not an easy job. And you really, I found this slide from Karen Dubo from a long time ago, and it says a tough hide over a very sensitive soul. And I think that is probably the best descriptor of a board chair. And then obviously also the ability to predict and navigate a storm, because occasionally storms arise in our nonprofits. So like I said, it's more than a title. It's the board chair and the CEO are like a dynamic duo, where one is the visionary and one is the sense maker. And if you think about it, it's really working in partnership, and the board chair and the CEO relationship is so important for the overall functioning health of the board and for the organization, because the organization can only be as good as the board allows it to be. So as I mentioned, as a board chair, the board is looking to you, whether you realize it or not, and whether they even consciously realize it or not. They're looking to you as board chair for all of the informal and informal leadership of the group. For example, how do you facilitate the meetings? Do you keep them on time? And we'll get into that in a little bit. But also looking at not only what you say, but what you do. Do you support the CEO? Do you try to have a good relationship with the CEO? Are you proactive and come prepared for the meetings? Do you try to understand what's happening with the organization and that type of thing? So, and I put be a good communicator, and because this is where I was hoping we would have some dialogue. Like when you think about a really good board chair, what are some of the qualities that made that person a good board chair? And so I'll give you time to type it in the chat box. But what are some of the things that you can think of that lead to a good board chair? One that I know of, we had a board chair that was really great at intervening when people were getting off task in discussion and keeping us back on track. She was so tactful, you didn't even realize you were being redirected. But she was very skilled in that way. Someone typed in, takes the lead on taking action outside of meetings. That's a great point. That's a really great answer, and we're going to get into that a little later also, because a board chair, that position is really big. It's more than just, like I said, more than just a title, more than just being a board member. So moving on, what can boards do to make sure they have a good relationship with the CEO? And keep in mind that when these slides say what can the board do, it is what can a board do, but really as the chair, like I said, as the chair, you're kind of the leader. So informally and formally, consciously and subconsciously, board members look to the chair for leadership, and how the board chair acts and handles himself or herself and the relationship with the CEO really reflects down into a lot of the rest of the board culture. So understand the job of the board and understand your job as the CEO, as the chair, to be like, oh, you know, this is more important than I realized, possibly. And then don't pretend to be an instant expert. You have people around the table, and that's why you have a group of people. And this, don't become a complaint department. That also looking at things from outside of the meetings, because typically it's not the inside the boardroom where conflicts really escalate, but rather outside of the boardroom. And so as a chair, how you work with the CEO and how you work with your board to handle conflict or disagreements, that has a lot of weight in the culture of the organization. So in the boardroom, there's a lot of things happening. As a board chair, you want to make sure that you're thinking about, how you're facilitating, and is everyone playing a role, and are you allowing everyone a chance to talk? How are your facilitation skills? Are you helping people stay on task? Do you have timed agendas? You want to make sure you're prepared for the meeting and know your agenda. And you should have set the agenda with the CEO, but at a minimum, if you didn't do that, you definitely need to know your agenda, because you do set the tone for the meeting, whether positive or negative. And like I said, encourage broad participation and try to end on a positive note and have everyone feel good. A few things, like share mission moments, or a recent story that you've heard, or even a kudos to the CEO, finding something that he or she has done recently that you want to congratulate, so that everyone leaves in a feel-good moment. And then for those of you that are CEOs out there working with chairs, you want to make sure that you meet regularly. And board chair, if your CEO isn't doing this, then encourage them. Call them and say, we have a meeting in 3 weeks, or we have a meeting in 2 weeks. What are you thinking for the agenda? And here are some of the things that I feel like should be brought to the table. And then you can ask the same for the CEO to do the same. And as a board and board chair and a CEO, you share the task of creating the board meeting agenda together. The board needs to have ownership of the agenda, but you still need the CEO's perspective in creating it, because you want to have the big picture of the board and the vision and the strategic direction of the board, along with the monitoring and day-to-day of what's going on in the organization from a CEO standpoint. But again, as a CEO, you want to make sure that you equip your board chair. You support the board chair during the meeting. You make sure that the board chair understands some of the issues. You try to meet with them ahead of time, get them information ahead of time. Be prepared to explain issues when the board chair needs you to, but let the board chair run the meeting. It is the board's meeting, not your meeting. And that's those are some of the most difficult things as a CEO to do, because you're so vested and you have the day-to-day knowledge that you want to jump in, but you really need to let the board do their work. And so your job is to help the board do their work. One of the things that we talked about, micromanagement, and if your board is micromanaging you, one strategy to turn that is to toss out some what we call generative questions, and have a generative culture. And you can do that by asking some of the bigger picture questions. You can look at, I'm trying to think of an example. Let's say a board member's getting nitpicky into some details about a program, and even to the point that the board member is saying, should we have this staff person? Is this staff person the best person to be working with this program and these set of clients? As a board chair, you need to realize that, you know what, we're really stepping in the weeds, and I need to facilitate this meeting to make sure that we get back to the higher level issues. So if you have a board member that's saying, you know, does this staff person need to be on this program, that's where you can step in and say, you know, we have a great CEO that I know can help. You know, thanks for raising that issue and that opinion. We have a great CEO that can take a look at that and let us know what you're thinking. On the flip side, let's talk about, do you have concerns how the program fits our mission? Or do you think the program should be have a different focus? Or are the outcomes what you want to see from the program? And thinking in a strategic level, not in the day-to-day and who's doing the delivery of the program. So building positive relationships, again, you know, number 5, actually, I think I would probably put at number 1 and number 5 are top. But again, know your role. As a CEO, know your role in the boardroom, what your role is to do and is not to do. And board chairs and board members, know your role in the boardroom and out of the boardroom, especially when you're volunteering, not when you're serving as a governing board member. And then one of the best ways to build the relationship and make sure you have trust is to stay focused on the mission, goals, and purposes of the organization. And that's part of what I was trying to say when I mentioned turning it into a generative discussion, is if people start getting into the weeds, and let's say the board chair isn't picking up on the fact that the discussion's getting into the weeds, then anyone at the table, board member or CEO, could say, you know, what about an XYZ? And come up with a question. And you may even want to have on the side of your notebook some go-to questions for helping to get the conversation back on track and not micromanaging. Like, where do you, if they're micromanaging finances, then it's, okay, what do you see our revenue being in the next 3 years? How do you plan to grow the donor base? Or how do you envision diversifying revenue streams? Or thinking about the mission and the goals, how does this relate to our strategic plan? Which would tell me you have a strategic plan. So if you don't have a strategic plan, and it doesn't have to be some fancy document, it's basically, do you have longer term goals? Do you have goals? Has the board set goals for the organization beyond 1 or 2 years? Let's say 3 to 5 years, possibly even longer, depending on your board, depending on your organization size and your programs. But what are the longer term goals? Where are you going? Because you can always refocus people's attention back to that, or have a go-to story, like a quick mission moment to help people refocus on why they're there. That's one of the biggest things to help in building the relationship as a board chair, being the liaison and trying to remember these things during a meeting and even outside of a meeting, so you can direct people back to the purpose and the why you're all there, and as a board member in a board meeting to try to, I don't want to say police, but try to monitor and help your other peers stay on track. Obviously, communication and honesty are keys to building trust, and trust is the key to a great board and CEO relationship. And in order to have the relationship, you need to have a relationship. So in other words, get to know each other, take time to talk about issues, and you need to take time to get to know each other and be a board chair. I'm going to back up here. Those of you that are on the call that are board chairs, be the type of board chair that is there for your CEO, that is supportive. I know I can go to my board chair and say, you know what, I'm struggling with this. I'm struggling with XYZ. Here's what I've been thinking. This is the route I'm thinking about going. What are your thoughts? I would like your opinion before I make my final decision. by framing it that way, I, as the CEO, I'm still in control of whatever that decision is, because the thing that I'm talking to my board chair about, let's say it is a staffing issue. I'm talking to my board chair about this staffing issue question that I have, and I know it's still my role as the CEO to manage all the staff to make sure the work gets done, but I'm asking for my board chair's thoughts and questions, or opinions, excuse me. So asking for opinions is different than saying, you know, what do you think I should do here? And then let the board have a free-for-all, and then they start micromanaging. And so there's ways to frame things where you can still own the role, but get cooperation between each other. And so outside of the boardroom, like we said, that's where a lot of the conflicts happen. That's also where a lot of the conflicts can be avoided or reduced, or you can have, as a board chair, you can have informal leadership in demonstrating how you support the CEO. For example, if something happens and it sounded like the CEO really screwed up, it's best if you as a board chair go directly to the CEO, talk to them as soon as they can, understand all the information, and then if you hear things from other people, especially other board members, you can say, no, I've talked to them, this is what happened, this is how we're rectifying the situation, yada, yada, or do it in a conference call if it's something that deems needing a conference call to several people, or a broadcast email to the rest of the board. But being that communication person in between, don't let things fester, because it can get out of hand very quickly. And so when you're thinking about conflict, again, think about the reason why you're all there, that you're all working towards the same goals, or you should be. Set your egos aside and what's best for the organization as a whole. Some causes of poor relationships, again, you know, this third bullet point, improper handling of complaints. Failing to do your homework, and CEO, some of that is you failing to make sure your board, and it's not your responsibility to make sure your board chair does their homework, but it is your responsibility to equip the board chair so that they have the homework to do, so that they can come to the meetings prepared, and to not have any surprises on either side. If you need to bring something up last minute in a meeting, you need to talk to either the CEO needs to talk to the chair needs to talk to the CEO before this happens. So then, obviously, at times, things go wrong. So what's best for the organization? Here again, it goes back to, why are you there? What's the purpose? What are your goals, long-term goals, and what's the purpose of the organization? Having clear communication, which is not being defensive and not being accusatory, but clear and professional communication, civil behavior, and communication that speaks to clarifying roles and trying to clarify misunderstandings. And then I'll leave you with this, because I think it's one of the best summaries. It's a shared understanding is reached through open, honest dialogue, and this is a lot of what we've talked about, of being willing to be transparent and willing to, as CEOs, willing to ask your board for advice or look at it as a professional partnership. And board chairs, when your CEO asks for help or your opinion, it's not a sign of weakness, and it's not a sign that they can't be trusted or that they're not capable. It's a sign that they see you as a professional partner, and so respect them as well. So it's the mutual respect, and having clarified roles and mutual respect can go a long way between the chair and CEO relationship, which then also affects the rest of the board and trickles down to the culture of the organization.